Please help us to put into our lives things that we learn here tonight. Please help us as we go through our lives. Help us to be the Christian people, the right example that we need to be every day. Help us to do everything we can to labor in your kingdom and help spread the borders of your kingdom. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Great to see all of you tonight. Appreciate the fact that some are able to be back with us who have been out of town and others who have been unable to be here. Dimple's a good example of that, and she looks plumb natural sitting up here in her pew. And we appreciate all of you for being here tonight. Be turning to Matthew chapter 20. This will be the location of our study, and we'll be looking at the very last verses of that chapter tonight. And this will be the last study for some time for us in this class from the book of Matthew. We'll be going into Vacation Bible School next Wednesday night, and then we will have our summer series coming up, and we can maybe return to the book of Matthew then later on. But we will be at a good point for us to take a break, because the rest of the book of Matthew will deal really with the last week of Jesus' life. And some call that the Passion Week, and we'll be looking at that. We're also studying that week at camp. That's going to be the theme of camp this year will be the week that changed the world, and that will be a study of the last week of Christ's earthly life. Let's look at the verses 29 through 34. Read those verses together from verse 29 through verse 34. And as they departed from Jericho, a great multitude followed him. And behold, two blind men sitting by the wayside, when they heard that Jesus passed by, cried out, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And the multitude rebuked them, because they should hold their peace. But they cried the more, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And Jesus stood still and called them and said, What will you that I should do unto you? And they say unto him, Lord, that our eyes may be opened. So Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. Jesus is winding down the so-called Perean ministry, where he went over to the eastern side of the Jordan and preached and taught and did miracles in that area. He is now coming back across the Jordan, going westward, and the first major city that he will come to will be Jericho, of Old Testament fame. And we'll talk about that city in just a minute. He had just taught about greatness in the kingdom and emphasized the importance of service. And he puts into practice now what he had been preaching and teaching. Because as the multitude viewed these two men, they looked upon them as a nuisance. But Jesus saw a need. And so he responded to that need and ended up healing them. I think it's fitting that such a miracle would be performed at the, you might say, end of the Perean ministry and at the beginning of his travel into Jerusalem for the final time there. Even though his passion was looming, Jesus took time to stop and show compassion to these two men. We do not know how old they were. We do not know exactly what the situation was as far as how they lost their sight and all of that. We aren't given all of those details maybe that we would like to know. We can know that in all probability, one of these men was blind Bartimaeus. We'll look at the other two accounts in Mark and Luke just briefly in this study. But the word passion comes from the Latin term passio, and it means suffering. So Jesus was going to suffer during this last week upon the earth. But in spite of his knowing that, he took time out to demonstrate humility, kindness, and compassion to these two men who were certainly in need. I want you to think with me, first of all, about the site, S-I-T-E, of the miracle. You'll notice that Jericho is mentioned. Jericho was famous for the fact that it was taken by the Israelites when they crossed Jordan and entered into the promised land proper. And it was taken without firing a shot. Remember the story about marching around the walls one time each day for 6 days, doing it 7 times on the 7th day, and the walls, as the little song for the children says, came tumbling down. The walls came tumbling down. Showed us the great might of God. Jericho would be situated about 5 miles west of the Jordan River. So they have come out from the eastern shore, across the Jordan, and then they travel about 5 miles and come to Jericho. It would be about 15 miles from there to Jerusalem, and they would ascend to 2,600 feet above sea level in that 15 miles. It would be a pretty steep climb, and it's estimated that it would take them about 6 to 8 hours to travel from Jericho to Jerusalem. Now, there's something interesting about this, because Matthew's account says as Jesus was leaving or departing from Jericho, this took place. Luke's account in Luke 18 verse 35 has him performing the miracle coming near, approaching Jericho. Now, is that a contradiction? There are lots of people who would say, see, I told you, the Bible contradicts itself. But is there some plausible and logical explanation? Would any of you want to venture an answer to that? You may have read material on it, or you may know your historical and geographical history well enough to have an explanation for that.
Jericho moved.
I'm sorry?
Jericho moved.
Jericho moved. You're right. That's exactly right. That's not the way that most people would say it. But there are 2 Jerichos. And sometimes people don't realize that. Jericho of the Old Testament was destroyed, wasn't it? Jericho would be rebuilt later on about 1 mile farther west than the old city was. So it's my belief that the miracle was performed between the 2 locations. He would be leaving old and approaching you. So that's a logical and plausible explanation. And most alleged Bible contradictions are that easily solved. If you find out, sometimes it may be because of a different name being used that people object, and they'll say, well, this fellow's called that, and over here it calls him this. It may be as simple as a change in language. Having a Greek name and having a Hebrew name. And the same person might be wearing two different names. Or it might be a Persian name. You'll remember that Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego had different names in Hebrew than are given to us in the book of Daniel. And there's usually a very plausible and logical explanation for those alleged contradictions. We have a couple of books on alleged contradictions of the Scriptures down in the library. But you can use Google and stuff like that now, and you can find the answer to those alleged contradictions. So there were two. Old Jericho was destroyed. You can read about that in Joshua 6. But it was later rebuilt, and you can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. So you have the two different cities. It was still very much inhabited in Jesus' time because Herod the Great had lavishly refurbished the city. I read just today about all of the things that he had built there. He built swimming pools, he built gymnasiums, he built gardens, and he just made it into a really super nice place because he preferred to live there during the cooler season because it was so much warmer than other parts of Judea. And so he spent a lot of money developing that area. And so there were still a lot of people there when Jesus lived upon the earth. So the miracle was performed, no doubt, between the two sites of the old city and the new city. And so Matthew has him departing Jericho. Luke has him approaching Jericho. Easily resolved. Now, I want you to notice the subjects of this miracle. We have two blind men who are said to have been sitting by the road. Here again, we have an alleged contradiction and is often pointed out by folks who are critical of the Scriptures. Mark and Luke only mention one man, each one of them. And as I said earlier, in Mark 10, Mark names him and even tells you his father's name. He was blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. Son of Timaeus. That's how you got Simon Bar Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah. And so this man is named Bartimaeus. And you'll notice, though, that neither writer denies the presence of another man. Neither one of them. And if you check Matthew very carefully, you'll find that he is usually more detailed than either Mark or Luke. You'll find, for example, that he talks about two demoniacs, two men who were demon-possessed. And he also mentions a little detail that we'll notice in Matthew when we resume those studies as he sends those disciples to get the donkey. He has you bring the donkey and the donkey's colt. Bring the donkey's baby with you. The other writers don't mention that foal in their account. So Matthew probably is more detailed than the other ones. It may very well be that they are thinking about the one who did the most talking. Have you ever noticed that when you have two people, there's one usually talks more than the other? Because, well, they just demand more attention, I guess. No, there's just a difference in people. And so it may be the one who talked louder, got more attention, so on. That may have been Bartimaeus himself. But these two men heard that Jesus was passing by. And that was really good news to them, because they no doubt had heard about what Jesus was capable of doing. You'll notice that their plea is for mercy. They desire mercy. Have mercy on us, thou Son of David. They probably knew something about the Scriptures. Why would we say that? Because they knew that the Messiah was going to be the Son of David. The Old Testament Scriptures were filled with statements to that effect. And so they had heard of the great miracles that he did. They might have even read those Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah will give sight to the blind.
They were blind, how could they read?
I'm sorry?
If they were blind, how could they read?
I didn't catch that last part.
If they were blind, how could they read?
Oh. I don't have to read to know. I've had people who couldn't read, and they would take offense to something that I would say in a sermon. What about those who can't read? And I would point out, you can always have someone read it to you. And, and I've encouraged people to buy the tapes of the Bible and utilize them. They were blind. I don't know if they had Braille or not. Do you think they had Braille back then?
Listen better too.
I'm sorry?
I'm sure they listen better than most people.
Probably.
I started to say a while ago, notice they heard. They heard. It's astounding sometimes how well blind people hear. It helps the other senses to really develop. And most of you, I guess, have heard me tell about Joyce, who went to school with us at Lipscomb. She was a Bible major, the only female Bible major. She made excellent grades. She studied Hebrew and Greek, took both Bible languages, and a lot of other very difficult courses, and did it all in Braille. She was blind and couldn't see hardly anything. But she was very, very knowledgeable and very good in her studies. But they were blind, but not helpless. And they knew what they wanted more than anything else. Here was Jesus saying, in essence, what can I do for you? That's a whole lot like Solomon being given the opportunity to ask for whatever he wanted. And he chose to ask for wisdom, which was a very wise decision, wasn't it? And here were two men who had a great need. They wanted to see. I've thought about this a lot, and I'm sure you have too. What would be the greatest loss if you lost one of your senses? What would be the greatest loss? Eyes. Temple's been having eye problems, so she's experiencing some of that. Barbara's mother was watching TV one day, and she pulled her glasses off and rubbed her eye. And when she rubbed, I can't remember which one it was, let's say she rubbed this eye, she realized she couldn't see anything on the TV screen. And that was when we came to realize that she had the macular degeneration. And the doctor was able to arrest it and keep it pretty well where it was. But that was a great hindrance to her. I still remember when Dad had cataracts on his eyes, and he became so depressed. He was really depressed. I mean, he never did that, you know. He just couldn't see. It was bothering him. He was going to haul some livestock one day, and he said, "Is there any way you can come up here and drive the truck to Cookville for me?" I said, "Well, I think I can." He told me going and coming. He said, I can't see well enough to drive. And so after we had his cataracts removed, he could see a lot better. And his disposition, attitude, outlook all changed dramatically. So it's a great loss to lose your sight. Now, maybe these men had never seen at all. Some lose their sight, you know, early in life. Others have accidents, whatever. But the loss of sight would be really bad to experience. But I'll tell you something that's worse than that. And that's when one is spiritually blind. That is the great blindness, the greatest blindness of all. You know, none are so blind as those who will not see. It's not a matter they cannot, they will not. And the Bible is filled with examples of those. But they were not ashamed to beg for mercy, and they overcame the intimidation of the crowd in their demand. People were saying, "Shut up, be quiet, and just go on about your business." You know, we don't have time to fool you. And I'm sure some of Jesus' disciples may have been involved in that, because they had tried to get the parents to take the little children and leave. And now here they were being interrupted again. No doubt they thought about Jesus being tired and weary. Maybe they wanted more of his attention. But Jesus was very adequate in supplying all their needs. Now, there's some things that I want us to learn from this miracle. And I would suggest to you that it might be a good idea for us to all pray to the Lord that our eyes might be open too. You ever thought about that? You may be saying, "Oh, I can see real well. I don't have any trouble seeing. I have excellent vision out there. I can read numbers at a long distance, but now up here is a different matter." But we need to be both nearsighted and farsighted. Sometimes there are things that are so close to us that we fail to see them. And sometimes there are things so far from us that we're not concerned about them. But let's think about this for a moment. Lord, open our eyes that we may see your power. Think about the creative power that God has. Think about the sustaining power that he has. We're told that the things that he created are held in their places by his word. It's God who is in control of all these things. The earth turns and, goes around the sun. It's astounding how these pictures from space just show the earth exactly like God said in his word. Suspended on nothing. Just suspended there. Not hanging by wires or chains, or not sitting, as the Egyptians believed in Moses' day, on the back of a huge turtle. Nobody ever figured out where the turtle was standing. But you think of all the weird ideas that have been developed throughout the centuries, and yet the Bible tells us that it is due to the power of God. But think about his saving power. Oh, he could heal blind men without just by touching their eyes, and using other things on other occasions. But think about His ability to save to the uttermost those who will believe Him, put their trust in Him, and obey Him. And it doesn't make any difference how wicked a person may have been. God has the power to save them through the blood of His Son and by the blood of His Son. But we need our eyes opened also to see ourselves as we are. Remember the two men who prayed in Luke 18? One bragged and boasted about how good he was, and the other one only uttered a few words. He said, "Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner." That's 7 words, isn't it? And this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. Why? Because he saw himself as he was. He realized who he was. Saw himself for what he was, a sinner. And he knew he needed the mercy and the grace of God. We need also to open our eyes and see the range of God's love. Where can we go that God's love does not reach us and cannot reach us? Well, we've already talked about some people who are so wicked. And I've known a few of those people who were reached by the gospel of Christ because they learned about the love of God. I've told the T.B. Larimore story several times. Some of you may not have heard it, about Larimore came into town to preach, and there was a hardened, callous sinner there that dozens of preachers had been asked to visit. They all had done it. The man had never responded to the invitation. Larimore went to see him, and the man responded to the invitation during one of the services and was baptized into Christ. And somebody asked the fellow what the difference was. Here's what he said. He said, "All those other preachers told me the truth. They told me I was a sinner and that I was the worst and sorriest sinner in the world, that I was lost and I deserved to be lost, and they kindly gave the impression that they were proud of it." But he said, when I heard Larimore preach, it seemed like he said, "You are one of the sorriest men ever. You're a sinner of all sinners. You're lost. You deserve to be lost. But you can be saved. I'm sorry you're lost." And he said he acted and gave me the impression that he was so sorry. Now there's a difference in our attitude toward people, isn't there? We need to be very careful about that and do the best that we can to let people know that the love of God makes it possible for them to be saved, regardless of who they are. They in penitence can render obedience to the gospel and be saved. Remember, God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. That tells us the extent of His love and just how great a love it is. And then Romans 5:6-8 tells us that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now that reminds us that He loved us and loves sinners in spite of their sin. He desires all to be saved and to come to God. We need also to pray that our eyes would be open so we can see opportunities for good. So many times there's opportunities right in front of us, as I said, up so close maybe that we ignore them. Opportunities to teach someone, to lead someone to Christ, just to do a good deed. In Galatians 6:10, Paul said, "As you have therefore opportunity, do good unto all men, especially those who are of the household of faith." We all have opportunities to do good. from time to time. They may come unexpectedly. But try to be prepared for those and be looking for those opportunities to sow the seed, to plant a word of encouragement. And let me see, I saw a sign just yesterday, I believe it was, somewhere that said the only people in the world who don't need encouragement are those who are dead. If you're living, if you're still breathing, you need encouragement, and that's good. Let's have our eyes open also and ask the Lord to help us to open our eyes to see the good in others. Sometimes we don't do that, do we? We anticipate and suspect the very worst about people sometimes for really no valid reason. And we need to remember that there's usually some good in others. Remember, the multitude saw those blind men as a nuisance. But Jesus saw that this was an opportunity for good. And there obviously was good about them because they recognized who He was. They sought His mercy. They sought His assistance. So that would be seeing the good in people. We need to pray too that our eyes would be open so that we might see the beauties of heaven. See those portals opening and see the extravagant beauty as described in the book of Revelation of that celestial city. And we need also, well, I'd encourage you to read Revelation 21 and 22 in particular. 20, 21, and 22 maybe. And think about Jesus' statement in John 14. I go to prepare a place for you. There are many mansions there. We need to try to visualize that and remember heaven and think about it often. But we need also to open our eyes and see the horrors of an eternal hell as well. That has a motivating principle. There's lots of preachers now that will not touch the subject of hell with the proverbial 10-foot pole. They don't want to make people uncomfortable. They say it turns people off. But I'm telling you that we need to understand the reality of Jesus' teaching. And it is said that Jesus had more to say about hell than any other subject. He has more to say about that than any other subject. It's a terrible place. Jesus came to give sight to the blind. That, I think, was fulfilled in a physical sense, of course, but His primary desire was to give spiritual sight to all of us. So let's ask Him to help us to open our eyes and look on the fields that are white unto harvest. You know, we can curse the darkness, we can light a candle. We can do either one of those two things. It's a lot better to do the latter than it is to do the former. It's very easy to get so depressed and down and out. Sometimes I just want to, and sometimes I do. Turn off the TV. I don't want to see anymore. Throw the paper aside. Don't want to read anymore about that. But there are good things that are being done, and there is still much goodness in the world. We just don't hear a lot about it. So maybe it's time that we start spreading good news instead of all the bad news. Any of you have any closing comments or remarks? We appreciate your being here tonight. We hope you'll be back with us next week. We'll be right in the middle of Vacation Bible School. We will have an auditorium class with classes each night. So we hope all of you will make your plans to come and to be a part of that. Got some good speakers lined up, and we know you'll enjoy that as well. That's the second bell. So